the left. This solution. It says 20% remaining, and I have an hour. I got 2 hours and 20 minutes, 69% remaining. I don't think it's right. I get hours saved. I have an hour and 17 minutes. We're on 44% battery. On 44%. Right. Yeah, I overcharged on that.
All right. Some of you had I think about 3 or 4 students in the class had their assignment graded online. It's either because I misplaced your printed copy or you didn't turn it in. But in either case, your grades were online. So if you didn't find it here, it should be online because I graded every assignment. And you have the next assignment due Wednesday, Monday. Do you have any questions about that? Yes, ma'am.
I just was looking up the secondary key online.
Okay.
It said that a secondary key would not be a part of any of the attributes, including the super key. Is that true?
Okay. Super key and secondary key really don't have much to do with each other. A super key is defined to describe a set of attributes that can uniquely identify drugs. A secondary key is really for indexing purposes. So, for example, you can have the city name or the city zip code, for example, zip code. It's much better. Zip code set up as a secondary key. So it enables you to look up your records by zip code very quickly. Another example is you can index your records as a secondary index on majors. So because that sometimes is a very common operation for users to want to, say for example here U of L, to want to look up students by majors or sort them by majors. If you didn't have a secondary index to do that, then it would be very, very slow. So the records, this has to do with the fact that database records are often stored in the order in which they were entered into the database. So Ben, for example, your record may got into the database first, right? And then about 30,000 records later, Seth Elvie, right? Record got into the database. And so even though his name starts with A and your last name starts with L, right? Physically, you're first, he's maybe 30th. And so what indexing does, secondary indexes especially, what it does is to allow you to organize these records using another layer of organization rather than the physical organization. That's what secondary indexes do. Answer your question.
And it could, so secondary key could be a part of your super attribute.
An attribute that has been part of a secondary key or is a secondary key could be part of a super key. Other questions? All look very happy. Okay. Did U of L women's team win last night? Did they play Connecticut as well? Did they win? They didn't win. Okay. So I posted the review guide, and please look at the first sentence and make sure that you understand it. This is only a guide. Right? You must carefully review all the materials that I have covered in the class and the topics that I've covered in class are really important topics. There are specific topics that I mentioned that are not going to be on the test. Includes, for example, network model, object-oriented model, XML, and I also said left join, right join won't be on the test. Right? All the pretty much everything else is going to be on the test in the first 3 chapters. And you can go through that. I have gone through most of it in class, but I want to emphasize again that you need to understand Crowsfoot, the Crowsfoot format. I've used it on a couple of occasions. There are numerous examples in the book, and you need to know the 3 types of relationships, for example, one-to-one, one-to-many, and many-many. And in the case of many-many, you may be asked to resolve it into 2 one-many relationships. And the assignments, of course. I think Wednesday next week, day of the test, Dan Murphy will come in to talk to the 410 class. 410, if you're interested, you can send me an email, and I can tell you where the class is. He's going to come in to talk to the students about how to interview for a job. And he's the guy whose email I posted. So, if you're interested, it's 8 o'clock in the morning, so it's kind of early. Some of you probably won't be able to come, but if you're interested. Anything else? No questions about the assignment? That's good. So let's go to Chapter 4. Let's continue with Chapter 4. Case. Now we need to replace these machines. running the same. So it's in documents, right? Yes. This is a local copy. So we discussed this composite attribute. We talked about that. Multi-valued attributes. That's where we stopped. I gave you an example of MBA students having 3 previous degrees, and we ended up using the bridge table and the previous degree table, and MBA students have a many relationship with previous degree because a student may have obtained many previous degrees, and the previous degree, of course, may have been obtained by many students. So that's multi-valued attributes. Here is the example in the book, and the color is a multi-valued attribute because different parts of the vehicle may have different colors. Now, derived attribute, a perfect example is age. Age, of course, is a value that changes all the time. So what's typically stored is date of birth. So age is, of course, derived. And that's a very simple example, but there are much more complicated examples. For example, revenue by product and stuff like that probably would have to be computed using a very complicated set of formulas. And the information or data needed probably would have to be gathered from different places. And that can be a derived attribute in the table. And so whenever you need it, all of these stored procedures, programs should be activated to compute that. So that's an example of a derived attribute. And there are some advantages and disadvantages. And you can look at that. Relationships, and we, of course, have seen relationships. And in this chapter, we're going to take a closer look at participation. Right? In other words, how the entities that are related by a relationship participates in a relationship. And there are a couple of terms that I would like to describe. First of all, connectivity. The type of connectivity, there are 3 types. One-to-one, one-to-many, and many-many. Right? So there are 3 types. So that's just a term that you may not be familiar with. Cardinality is, again, describing a concept that we really have been discussing in class. But when you describe a relationship, as in this homework assignment, which is returned, you can say that each student may have one or many classes, and each class may be taken by one or more students. And when you say one or more, you're talking about cardinalities. So as you can see here, it expresses the minimum and the maximum number of entity occurrences, or the rows, that are associated with each row in the cardinality. Right? So that gives you a very concise way of describing your business rules. Just keep in mind that this is a very difficult business in that we're describing using a very crude language, something that has to be performed or implemented in a very concise way. And so, take a look at this. Professor teaches class. Here it says, each professor, please note it says, each professor may teach 1 to 4 classes. Right? Now, there may be a professor who teaches 1 course. There may be a professor who teaches 4 classes. Right? But as long as you have professors teaching 1 to 4 classes, you're not violating the business rule. And then, of course, you have each class is taught by one and only one professor. So it says that you have to have a professor before they enter the class. Now, think about the implication of this. If this is indeed how you set up the database, then you won't be able to enter a class into the database until you know who's teaching it. Would you want to do that?
Probably not.
Why not?
Well, because if you create a class, you might, like the university might decide that they want to have a certain class, but they don't know who they want to teach it yet.
Okay. You see, so that you're correct, right? And in fact, that's what this university does, right? How many times have you seen a course or class denoted by TBA, to be determined, right? To be determined, TBD, or something like that. Or instructor is, I don't know what the symbol used for, what is the symbol used for that. But sometimes you may be in a particular business situation where you have to require that, right? If that happens to be the rule that you want to enforce, then the database should reflect that. Now, it is a very, very important principle in designing information systems. When I say information systems, of course, it includes applications, users, databases, and so on and so forth, right? So an information system is really a very broad term. It consists of many different components. You want to have the business rules as close to the data as possible. Why? Because the same set of data may be accessed by different applications. If this is a general rule, then you want to have it in the database so that you can write as many applications to hit against the database as you want later on and still have the rule enforced, right? You don't have to reinforce the rule every time you write a new application. Right? That's kind of intuitive. Would you agree? So most of the applications really, like Java or C#, C# programs, they really focus on presentation logic, right? A lot of presentation logic, forms, and how to collect information, and some business logic as well, like searching. You bring stuff into an array and you perform a search. But a lot of business logic, I would say 50% of the business logic, it's not uncommon for 50% or more of the business logic to be in the database, to be implemented in the database itself. By database, I mean within the database management system. So everybody has one single point of entry and one single point of exit. So it's much easier to enforce uniformity throughout the entire platform, which will contain many databases. Any questions? Okay. Again, here are some concepts that I would like to introduce. Existence dependence means that a role may not exist without the corresponding parent. And this is an example that I think you can all relate to. Okay. And for example, course name. And then that's how we call them class. You can call them section. Let's say class. And you have class ID. And that's the DK. Our class ID, what is our class ID? I forgot what it is. It's an 8-digit number or something like that, right? It's a unique ID, every class. And so that's the class ID. But a class is always a class, an instance of a specific course, right? So that's FK. See? And there's stuff like room ID and so on and so forth. And now, entity exists in database only when it's associated with another related occurrence, which means that you may not have a class without the corresponding course, right? So we already have CIS 310 as a course in the catalog. Then we can offer 310.01, 2012, 310.01, 2012, this is what, spring, so fall, for example, and so on and so forth. So you can have many instances of the course. So, see that? Existence independence. Okay. So can you give an example to show that?
Teacher?
Huh?
A teacher?
Teacher what? You have to have two tables, right? Teacher's table, what's the other table?
Teacher and courses. You can have a teacher and different teachers and courses.
Okay. So you want to say that, right? So that's the primary key. And faculty name and others. So what kind of relationship do you think we would have between the two? Normally. Let's just simplify it by saying normally, what kind of relationship? Between faculty and class.
One many.
Can you describe it, Michael?
One faculty member teaching classes.
It's not complete, right? So you have to describe
Oh, I
it
mean,
the other way as well.
one class, or a class can only be taught by one.
So you have, Michael said, one and only one, which is true in most cases. Let's just say it's true here. But sometimes it can be taught by many, more than one. I've done it once with another faculty member, but let's just say it's one. So what about here?
The optional.
It would be optional? You make it optional? We talked about that earlier today, right? So that's optional. So in other words, a class may exist, or a row in the table of class may exist without a corresponding faculty member being there. You see? Right? So you can start entering classes into the class table without knowing who the faculty members are, or who the faculty member is for each class. But this way, in this relationship, you can, right? You have to know what the course is before you offer a section of that course or class.
So would this be an example of dependence or independence?
These would be an example of independence.
Okay.
Dependence. Existence. Yeah.
So there's no crow's foot notation to denote whether it's independent or dependent?
If it's a weak entity, which is existence dependence, and the primary key, we will reach that point, and I'll show you when we reach that point, okay? Because it might be confusing to bring it up here, but that's a good question. Weak relationships. Now, you must have really enjoyed setting up relationships in the first few minutes, right? And I gave you that tip. I don't know how many of you actually read it, but if you hadn't read it, then it will be, I think it's just a strange thing that Bill Gates did in the new VCO. In the old VCO, it's really easy to set up a relationship so that it's non-identifying. All right, let me show you some examples here. This is a weak relationship between course and class. Right? Yeah, now, weak in that it is non-identifying, meaning that the class primary key, now please note, the primary key of the class is not made up of, among other things, the primary key of the course. If that's the case, then it's weak, and the dotted line would indicate that, right? Right. It means that the primary key of the child table, the many side, right, or where the foreign key is, the child side is where the foreign key resides, which in this case is class, right? Right there, course side code. So the primary key of class is class code. It doesn't use course code. Now, if you look at the next example, see how this is the solid line? It means now that this is a strong relationship or identifying. Here, of course, you probably have seen this many times, right? A few times maybe when you were setting up relationship. This is not what you were supposed to do in assignment 3, and none of you did that, I don't think. And in this case, the primary key of class has, among other things, the primary key of the parent table, which in this case is the course code. So if you do that, which you see sometimes, okay? And so in this case, the class, of course, would then have two attributes, or composite primary key. We have seen composite primary keys only in bridge tables. Have you noticed that? Right up to this point, we only have seen composite primary keys in the bridge table. Here, of course, we are now seeing a situation where you have a composite primary key in a non-bridge table. Yeah.
So it's considered a strong relationship if and only if it has the primary key as part of its composite.
Yes. And it's existence dependent.
And it's existence.
But it may be existence dependent, but not a strong relationship, right? Like in the previous example. I know it's a little confusing. Here, of course, it's a non-identified relationship or weak relationship, but it's existence dependent. In other words, you may not have a class without the corresponding course.
So how did you do that in the DO?
It will turn into a solid line. If you go into,
I couldn't figure out how to make it weak and inventory.
I was promised that it would work. Okay. All right. So. We got this guy last. This got to this point last time as well. It's not responding. All right. After the class, I'm going to pretend that I was really, really angry. Okay. And tell them to fix this. This is. I apologize. So, but then what happens is that when you click on the relationship, you see properties of the relationship show up in the lower half, and then on the somewhat to the right, there are two choices you can make. You can either click identify or click non-identify. That's how you do that.
But I guess when I had it set up and I clicked identifying and it made the solid line, then it would make the foreign key a part of the primary.
That's right. That's what you don't want to do.
And so how do you
In
know?
this assignment. Okay. The tip I gave you in course assignments is that you set up the relationship, right? And immediately you check identify and then uncheck identify. In other words, check identify and then check non-identify. And that would do it. Right? And that's a problem, I think. I don't know why they haven't fixed it. That when you're big, you can do stuff like that. This is not ethical.
I guess they just want to keep you from making
Weak entities are much more often common than strong, weak relationships are much more common than strong relationships, as you can see later on in this class. Unless bridge tables, often, they are what you call as, they have strong relationships, right? Because in the bridge table, you use the primary keys of the related tables as your primary key, right? Remember in Roman, you recall that? Not making any sense? My daughters told me I should go watch this movie called Woman in Black. Yeah. And they're crazy about it. I'm not though. Took them to watch Mission Impossible over the break. They didn't care. The only thing we both like water the Oh, a great piece of information. The new season of Walking Dead starts this Sunday. No emails, okay? About 8 o'clock on Sunday. It's great. I apologize. I should have fixed that. I couldn't fix it. I don't have administrative rights to this machine. I told them many times, two times to reinstall that, but apparently it didn't work still. And so going back to this, but then you can try that. Okay, you can even try that on your laptop if you want to right now. So this is a weak relationship, and it's weak because the child table, which in this case is the class table, the many side table, doesn't have the primary key of the parent table as part of its primary key. Right, so we only have class code. And here, of course, it's a strong entity because course code is also part of the primary key. So the same attribute can be a primary key attribute and a foreign key at the same time. Weak entities needs two conditions. Existence dependent, you know what it is, right? And primary key partially or totally derived from the parent entity. So going back, class is a weak entity. So it's a weak entity because it is in a strong relationship. How do you remember that? I mean, it's weak, right? It needs a strong relationship with the parent. Like my daughters are weak. They couldn't survive without me. I was buying airplane tickets for them, and they're minors. So, under 18. One of them is still under 16. No, under 16 or minor for purposes of boarding an airplane. So I have to participate in the process. And you have to pay $100 if you're flying the national to a minor. Is this clear to think? So it's determined by business rules. Now, why would you want to make it a weak entity? Sometimes you make it a weak entity because it conveys more meaning, right? Semantically, it's clearer. So let me give you an example. You have an employee table which has employee ID as the primary key. And it has other fields. And then you have a dependent table. Now, you could set this up just like course and class. Right? You can set it up so that you have a weak relationship, so that every dependent, you have a unique dependent ID and name and so on and so forth. And then the employee ID as the foreign key to relate the dependent to the employee. Right? Or you can set it up as a strong relationship so that this would be a weak entity. So we said, let's say, so this together, this is PK, but this is FK as well. Right? So this is much more meaningful by people looking at the database design to see, oh, okay, you cannot be a dependent without being dependent upon an employee, which is the case, right? But still, by doing this, you can see people find the relationship much easier to do. There are conventions that people use in certain domains. So as you work in certain areas, or within the same company sometimes, they introduce and they follow in database design, and therefore in database use. So people would expect you to follow the same practice. Other questions? So there you go. That's that example. Mine looks like a piece of apple, right? All right. So the cardinalities. Can you understand the cardinalities as given in the book? It won't be on this test, but on the next test, I would ask you to place the cardinalities on the relationship. Right? And this will convey, actually this here allows you to do that. This will convey to the reader of the design, okay, that each row or each dependent may be dependent upon one employee and one employee only. And each employee may have 0 or n number of dependents. We want your dependents to be as few as possible, of course. Of the population are government themselves. So Obama has a lot of you know what liabilities are. Social Security report. Remember, right? Those are government liabilities. You don't know. You're liable for it. When I get old, I'm going to count on you to pay for my welfare. That's the real reason why I care so much about how much you learn. Because the more you learn, the more productive you will be. The more productive you will be, the more taxes you're going to pay. The more taxes you're going to pay, the more guaranteed my Social Security paychecks and my Medicare paychecks are paid. Medicare. So I'm all for more taxes. The older I get, the more I'm going to vote for those people who will keep the taxes going up. You need to understand those relationships. Do you vote? Do you even care? It's going to affect you. One morning you're going to wake up and your joints going to go. You don't want to go to the office. Well, you can't go to the office. Then what do you want to do? You're going to stay home and write SQL code. Still be able to feed yourself. That's how significant this class is. You need to make those connections, and all of a sudden, all this pain and suffering, nothing. All right, so it's about 60 to 80 trillion dollars. And our national debt, government debt, is about 15 trillion dollars. It's 100% of GDP. And it goes up by about $1 trillion a year. So if you owe as much as you make, sooner or later, you're going to have to pay a lot of interest, right? Right now, the interest is low for U.S. Treasuries, government bond, because of all these risks around. Greece, Europe, the economy is going to slow down, global economy is going to slow down, and so on and so forth. At some point, people are going to get tired of lending to the U.S. government and getting like 2-point-some% in interest for a 30-year bond. More money for someone for 30 years. And pay 2%, 2.5, 2.9% interest. 10-year, it's less than 2%. That'd be nice. I would like to be able to borrow money for 10 years at 10%, at 2, less than 2%. Beautiful. Prices are going up. Everything. Gas, eggs, cheese. Those are essentials, right? See how much more Sam Adams cost today than 5 years ago. That's an essential good. Okay. I want to make what we do in the classroom relevant. Right? That's why I'm talking about those things. We don't live in a vacuum. Okay, so here's a sample database for employee and dependent. And as you can see, employee 1 has 2 dependents and 8 has 3 dependents. Okay. And unless 8 makes a lot more money, 8 will have a lower average income. So relationship participation, we talked about this, optional and mandatory. And in that case, employee is mandatory to dependent. But dependent is optional to employee, thank God. All right? So you have, as you can see, the same relationship, but participation can be different for the 2 tables involved. So dependent is optional to employee, but employee is mandatory to dependent. You know that? Questions? Those are the symbols, and we've seen those. And any questions about this? I think we still like database. Class, okay, we talked about this. Class is optional to course, but the course is not optional to class. But it all depends on the business rule, right? If the underlying business rule says, if you have a course in the catalog, then you have to offer at least 1 section. Then what the lower panel has would be the right design. You see, it all depends on the business rule. That's why you need to understand the business rule. You need to gather the business rule correctly, interpret correctly what the user tells you, so you come up with the correct business rule. some changes are easy later on, like changing the mandatory or optionality of a relationship, in a relationship. That's easy to do. Some changes are difficult. After you have built 300 applications against the database, and you want to make a structural change, all of these applications are going to be affected. Right? And that is going to be very, very costly. Now, I'm not making this up. When I was teaching way back 15 years ago, when I started teaching, there was a PhD student in chemistry, and he really, really liked programming, but he couldn't get money to go to school in a computer science program or a CIS program, so he had to do a PhD in chemistry because he was very good in science, because they pay him to go to do a PhD in chemistry. But he would take my classes, like all the programming classes, the database classes, and so on, data structures classes. And when he left, he went to Chicago, and he went to work for a Canadian bank in Chicago. And he designed the database. Right? He designed the database. It was a small bank. And the design was so bad, right, that he had to go back and fix things, because he was the only one that knew how to fix the database, because he designed it. All the deficiencies were his. So, which turned out to be a good thing for him, because every time he went back, they paid him. Consulting him, which was good money. So you have to be very careful, because when you have poor design, when it needs to be improved, when it needs to be modified, then the applications may fail. So that's why database design is so critical. Relationship degree. We have seen binary relationships only so far. What's a binary relationship? A binary relationship is a relationship that involves two tables. All right? But you can easily imagine a relationship that involves probably one or two tables. But a unary relationship or recursive relationship might be a little more difficult to imagine. But once you see an example, it's not that difficult. Okay. So, employee managers. Employee, right? So let's take a look at that. You know that the employee table can have a relationship with other tables, such as dependent and so on and so forth. And those are binary relationships. In this example, we're going to have a unary relationship, a recursive relationship. So your employee ID is the primary key, and you have employee name, and then after the other fields, you have a manager ID. And that's going to be your foreign key. Right? Right? So there's a relationship, and that's how you draw that. You can draw it like, I'm going to draw it like this. It's easy to see. So as you can see up there, what kind of relationship is this? What's the connectivity type? One minute? Can you expand on that? Can you explain why it's 1 minute? Who said 1 minute? Okay, yeah. Why is 1 minute? Explain the business rule. Describe the business rule for the relationship. Okay. Keith?
One employee manages many employees, and many employees are managed by one employee. Optional on both.
Okay. almost perfect. One employee may manage 0 or more other employees, and each employee may be managed by one and only one employee. Okay, so therefore, everybody has a boss. I have 3. My 2 daughters and my wife. So I'm an exception. But everybody, each employee is not a boss, right? Is not a manager. So therefore, this has to be optional. Does it make any sense to you? Right? Because, for example, I'm not a manager at home, right? So you have to make this optional. Let's look at the next table.
So the manager may not be managed by anybody else.
All right. I'll address that in a second, okay? So we have employee ID, which is the primary key. We have employee, let's say, name. And then we have, excuse me, manager ID, the primary key, right? So let's have some employees. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. A, B, C, D, and 1. All right. So we have 5 employees, and now A is my boss. Okay, but A, in addition to managing me, also manages Steve. Okay, and then if A doesn't have, let's say A has 2 as his or her manager. Okay, and then what do we have? C is also managed by 2. Now we're saying, hey, who's B's manager? The top person can be the manager of himself or herself, right? That's why we have 1 and 1. So that's how you could resolve that. But it depends on the business rule. If it's not the case, then you can change this to an optional sign, meaning that there's someone in the company that doesn't have a manager, maybe the CEO. The CEO is managed by the board of trustees, by the board. So this is a implementation of this. Do you have any questions about this? So that's an example of a unit relationship. Okay, and we have time to look at another one.
Why would you set it up like that as opposed to just having that connect to the manager ID table?
There's no manager. There's only one physical table.
Okay.
Right? You would only have one table.
But the manager ID is a foreign key.
It's a foreign key. It's just a column. It's a field.
Okay.
So it's not a table.
But where's it coming from?
Well, it came from the fact that you have put it into the employee table to implement that relationship. Because it is not necessary to have a manager table because it would be just redundant information.
So the foreign key is referencing its own table.
Yes. That's why it's called recursive. Is recursion a concept that's, have you had recursion before? Some of you do. Recursion in programming means that a method will call itself. Are you familiar with the Tower Hanoi problem? That's a recursive problem. Okay. One of these days, we got stuck in the elevator. I'll describe it to you. The Tower Hanoi problem. It's one of the most beautiful problems in the world. And the solution to it, the recursive solution to it, it's even more beautiful. Okay. Dan, did I answer your question?
Did you ask me a question?
Did I answer your question?
Yes, you did. Thank you.
Right. So we're going to do another example. Employee. And we have employee ID, which is still the primary key. I'm going to stop writing PK, but you know, in Visio, you're going to see that. By underlining it, of course, I'm making it the primary key. And we have employee name. Now, I'm going to introduce a foreign key called spouse ID. UPS doesn't allow employees to marry each other, right? And we don't have that rule here in this classroom. Against that, right? Or at U of L. So you see employees that are spouses. So what kind of relationship is that? How would you draw that? What's the connectivity type of relationship? I know you're not married, but
Would it be one-to-one?
one-to-one?
They don't get one-to-one.
Right. And so it's 1-to-1, right? So we know that at least there's one bar at each end. What about is this 0-1 or this 1-1?
0.
0. Here too, like this. How do you describe the business group?
Now the other one would be the village word, because the spouse has to be associated with the employee ID.
Yeah. Okay. The rest of the class. Daniel, can you describe the business group? The way you see it.
Yeah, an employee may have 0 or 1 spouse, and each spouse is associated with 0 or 1 employees.
No, you're describing it the way it's given. But you think it should be different.
Right.
Let's do the table itself, all right? Please, all of you think about this, because this is why you came today, right? Okay, I'm going to draw this. Employee ID, employee name, and spouse ID. So employee 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, A, B, C, D, and E. And so let's pair them up. Let's say, how would you represent the fact that A is married to B?
2.
What? To where? Here? And here? Would you write something?
There you
here?
would put 1.
You sure?
Yeah.
You're absolutely sure.
Yes.
That's what the law says, all right? The A, B are married, then they're married to each other. Right? So you're right. Okay. So let's say C is now married. these two are married to each other, D and E. So what would you have here? Okay. So that would be left as null, right? So now that is unless the company makes everybody marry everyone else, then the number of employees has to be even to begin with. Right? But that's unlikely. So this is, say for example, is what we have, and we agree that this is probably very good, very closely reflects the reality. If this is the case, does this rule describe that? Okay, no.
If the employee has a spouse, they must have a spouse ID. But if they don't have a spouse, they don't have
Here it says an employee may be married to 0 or 1 other employee. Okay? And the other way around it says a spouse is the spouse of one employee. Right? You see that? So an employee is not optional to a spouse, but a spouse is optional to an employee. Assuming that you only marry your coworker. Kind of odd.
So that is not correct.
Then you have to, because the employee, in this relationship, there are always two sides, right? But in this case, we have virtual sides, actually. Right? There's only one physical copy of the employee table. Right? But to the spouse side, right, employee is not optional. But to the employee side, for the employee side, the spouse is optional, like C. We're going to use another.
If you were to say that the spouse did not have to work for that company,
Then it would be, yeah, then it would be, yes. Yes. So this is kind of a strange example. Look at this table. Let me change it to CID. Now, you know that 310, what are the prerequisites? 310, you all gave me that.
300 and 199.
300, 199, right? All right, so if you want to capture this relationship, okay, if you want to capture that relationship, what kind of relationship is that? You already said one side is many because each course may have one or more or 0 prerequisites, right? There are courses that don't have any prerequisites. Would you agree? So it's 0 many, right? On one side. What about the other side?
A prerequisite has to be a prerequisite for many.
Prerequisite has to be a class ID.
Wouldn't be 0 to many again, because prerequisite can be a prerequisite for none of the classes, or it's not all the classes, but it can also be a prerequisite for many of the classes.
So each course may have 0 or many prerequisites, right? Right? And each course may be the prerequisite for
0 or many classes.
0 or many other courses. Would you agree? You agree, okay. So in this case, it's a many-many relationship, right? But it's recursive. It's unary, right? In the unary, in that we have this one physical copy. How do you actually do this? You want to enter that information, like represent the fact that 310 has prerequisite 199, 800, and so forth. So you have your course. Let's say 1, 2, 3. Okay. Let me use 310. Okay. 199. What is it? 200. 320. 410. 470. This is some of the CIS classes. And this is of course database. And this is introduction to programming. This is advanced programming. This is system analysis and design. And this is management of information systems. Okay. Now we want to represent some actual facts that reflect that prerequisite relationship. So remember that when you have a many-many relationship, always, what?
Introduce a bridge table.
A bridge table, yes. Prerequisite. And in the prerequisite table, a bridge table, which is what? A weak entity in a strong relationship, right? Some of the concepts are used. So you can't remember. I mean, I did use a lot of this today. So you have your course ID as part of the primary key, and you have prerequisite ID as part of the primary key. And you have something like effective date. In other words, after this point in time, you have to follow that in your curriculum. All right, so it's now easy, right? 310 as 199. Oh, well, I forgot to put out 300. 300 is what? That's CIS, right? Yeah. So 310, 300. Okay. What is 320's prerequisite?
Same thing.
Same thing? You sure? When I say, are you sure? Usually I'm right. Right. So, and then of course 200 as 199. Right? And you can check the dates. Now, you can see that every row is unique, right? Let's see the flexibility of this structure. So, each course may have 0 or 1 prerequisites. Right? Like, say for example, 199 doesn't have any prerequisites, which assumes that's the case, even if this is the entire table. So it's But each prerequisite is the prerequisite for one and no, excuse me. Each row in this prerequisite table, right, describes the prerequisite for a course. Only that one course. Similarly, each of these, each course may be the prerequisite of many other courses. Right? Like part of these, right? 199 is the prerequisite for 3 different courses. So that's how you draw that. I represent. Take a careful look at this. Now we open for questions.
That's still considered a unary relationship.
Yes, it is unary. Conceptually, it is, right? Conceptually. See, that's how you draw that. That's how you classify it. And of course, when you actually implement it, then it's different. It looks different. Questions?
Why doesn't there need to be a bridge table diagram?
Because, why you have to have a bridge table?
Since I'm thinking back to one of our assignments where the benefit table was included in the diagram.
Right, that's at the lower level of design. This is at a higher level of design. At a higher level of design, sometimes you just want to, especially at the beginning, you don't have time to work out the details. Like you don't even know all the fields. So you just want to denote the fact that there's a many relationship. Right? You know that much. But you don't know much else. But when you actually move further along in the design process, then you say, hey, this is really what we want to do. Why is today important? You know? Because today, after many delays, right, the Greek government is meeting to decide whether to take the terms laid down by the European community. Okay. So they, instead of, I forgot, instead of making $2,000 a week, euros a week, they would agree that all government workers would make $1,000 some dollars a week. Cut. You owe people money. You cut. So I don't know what the resolution is. It should be interesting. They will talk about it in the news. Okay, I'll see you Monday.